Hey YouTube, Alex here, and in today's video I'm gonna go over dimming thermostats, pulse proportional thermostats, and pretty much when to use them. There's a lot of other really great videos on YouTube that cover like Herpstats, Varium Electronics, Freedom Breeder, Helix, all the thermostats that are arguably more professional grade. What I tend to see in these videos is people reviewing the thermostats and not so much breaking down what the thermostats do and when to use them appropriately. So that's what I'm going to do with this video is, whether you've got a Herpstat like I've got in front of me here or a Varium Electronics thermostat, I've got one of those too. You'll see it later in the video. Just how to use it correctly. When I say correctly, I mean sort of in the safest and most efficient way for you and as far as heating your animals is concerned. Unfortunately, every once in a while you see a hobbyist that loses their collection due to a fire, and often it's because of a faulty heating element, which if you're running a heating element without a thermostat, that's really unsafe. So that's why I'm making this video. So to start off, this is my Herpstat 1. This is actually an exact Herpstat that I got from a high school buddy of mine. So Patrick, if you're watching, thank you. It's still working really well. But this just runs one of my corn snake enclosures. It's running a heat panel, and this is set to dimming mode. So depending on the model thermostat you have, if I go into the settings here and I enter the output configuration, you can see there's dimming, pulse, cooling. Herpstats have a lot more options. You can go into humidity, but the main two heating modes are dimming and pulse. So I have this set to dimming. And when we're using a dimming thermostat, what it is doing is it is, in a sense, regulating the exact amount of power to the heat source. So you can see this little percent button right here says 2%. This means that my heat panel inside this enclosure where the Herpstat's sitting on top of is currently running at 2, now 3% capacity. And so as you can imagine, on a colder day, when it hasn't heated up to my desired temperature, it's gonna run or add more power if it's not near 75.7. I also do night drops on a lot of my snake cages, so during the nighttime hours, this temperature will lower and therefore the heat panel will not have any power applied to it. If you guys haven't seen my video on how I set up my heat panel probe, I'll leave a card right up here. Definitely check that out. But in summary, what this thermostat is doing is it is taking the power to the heat panel and it is dimming it. So if we open up the cage, you can see here's the heat panel. So the snake, if he wanted to heat up, he would sit on the ledge or on the bark, or sometimes he even just sits right there and he heats up under the heat panel, and he can go all the way to the cool side if he wants to. This is my Animal Plastics T8 cage. Really good cage company. Highly recommend Animal Plastics. So the point is, that is how you would use a dimming thermostat for a heat source like a heat panel. You would also use dimming thermostats for single heat tape model racks. You can also use them for incandescent fixtures if you want to dim a light. I personally am not a fan of that because I feel like in nature, like it's a sunny day right now, the sun doesn't exactly dim throughout the day except for cloud cover, but a light bulb flickering in an animal cage might not be as desirable for your captive inhabitants. Dimming settings also work really well for heat pads, and like I said, specifically the single tape heat racks, like a Sea Serpent's rack, or like a lot of people do a DIY rack where they just run one strand of heat tape. That would be ideal for dimming. So that's how we use a dimming thermostat. Okay, I know you guys are probably sick of hearing about dimming thermostats, but one last example. Here's my Herpstat 2. So unlike my Herpstat 1, which was utilizing dimming on a radiant heat panel, for my corn snake display setups, I'm using it with heat tape. So if you look under here, this is my 6-inch THG heat tape, and right there, if the camera can pick it up, that tiny little spot in the center of the screen is the probe attached to the heat tape via electric foil tape. So what is happening is in the snake setup, right, we have the heat tape set to our current temperature, which is 88.5 degrees, and it'll make the bottom of the cage in here 86, where the snake can stretch out and absorb the belly heat. So it's just a different way to utilize dimming on a different heat source. Like I said previously, you guys saw dimming on a radiant heat panel, and this would be a dimming thermostat on heat tape, which at the moment it's not even on because the bottom water dragging cage here actually typically heats the base pretty well. So this is not on during the day, or if it is, it's only running at 1% capacity. So there you have it. Now let's go on to pulse proportional heating. Alrighty guys, so to wrap up this video, I'm going to discuss thermostats that are supplying heat in a pulse proportional mode and when to use pulse proportional thermostats. So here is my incubator. This is a hotbox incubator, and as you can see, whereas we were looking at Herpstats last time, this is a Vivarium Electronics VE200. And this is set to pulse. Just like how the Herpstat had the probe either under the radiant heat panel or on the heat tape, you're putting the probe, say in this incubator, dangling it in the air, and the heat source will turn on and off in a steady pulse setting, so that way your temperature stays stable. In the case of Chinese water dragon eggs, I have this incubator set to 83 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can see the low and high history of this incubator has not fluctuated a single degree, and that's because for an incubator you want it to be very insulative. So the big question is, compared to dimming, like Alex, why would I not use dimming on an incubator? Why do I have to use pulse? When would you use pulse, or at least the pulse setting, to say the least? It depends on the type of product you're using. So if we go all the way back to the start of the video, when I called Bob at Pro Products, and if once again, I believe I left a tag which you should click at the top of the video as far as how I set up my Pro Products heat panels. Bob said you can run Pro Products on dimming and pulse. I just use dimming on it because according to Herpstat, they say that is their most efficient setting. Vivarium Electronics thermostats come with the option for dimming and pulse. In the case of an incubator, I'm using pulse because if I have this on dimming, it means the heat source is physically on all the time, which I do not want. I want to keep the temperature very, very accurate in an incubator setting. So I like it that it's on and off in small bursts to keep it right at 83 degrees Fahrenheit. Vivarium Electronics radiant heat panels, they suggest that you run those on pulse. Makes sense since most people use Vivarium Electronics stats for the pulse setting, and therefore Vivarium Electronics would manufacture their radiant heat panels for pulse as opposed to dimming. The other and final heat sources that I want to mention, which are sort of the rule breakers, and I just know this off the top of my head, a lot of people suggest using ceramic heat emitters on a pulse proportional thermostat because, again, a ceramic heat emitter, if you just turn that sucker on, it will get really hot, and then you turn it off and it's still technically super hot despite not having power to it. Whereas if you're running a ceramic heater on pulse, you're going to have a nice steady supply of electricity to that ceramic heater without it overheating your enclosure and potentially your animal. Lastly, and so this is going to go back a little bit, for those of you that remember my review of the Herpstat 2 Redline, if you are using professional rack systems, I work at a local pet shop, so I'll put some photos in here. I have ARS 7030 units, I've got an ARS 1065 unit. When you're using any professional rack system, you want to make sure that since you are plugging in each level of heat tape into a multiple outlet or a power strip, you run those on pulse, because you're running different levels of heat tape all plugged into one multi-outlet. You know, let's just face it, if you have a 10 level high rack, you're not running 10 thermostats on it. You usually run 1 or 2 and you have different zones. Freedom Breeder does this. That's why the Freedom Breeder stats typically run on pulse. I don't own any Freedom Breeder stats currently, so I can't really relate as far as my own personal use of them, but I've used them at the shop. It's the same principle as running a Vivarium Electronics on pulse or a Herpstat on pulse. So again, that's the way I wanted to sort of wrap up this video. For most heat sources, or should I say most single heat sources, a single radiant heat panel, a single thing of heat tape for belly heat, or even like a dimming a deep heat projector by Arcadia or Zoomed, you're going to use the dimming setting. For incubators, for ceramic heat emitters, and for professional rack systems where you have heat tape plugged into a power strip, you would then use a pulse proportional setting to maintain that temperature. So I'm gonna wrap up the video here. We can take a peek at some of these eggs cooking. They're due to hatch any day now. Apologize for the condensation. You got to keep your incubators humid. But I hope you guys found this video helpful. I know thermostats and the settings that they come with can be really tricky for people, and it was definitely an area that I struggled with at first. After I learned it, I've had a lot of success. You know, as long as you know how to use your thermostats, you too will be just as successful with your animal keeping, egg hatching, and everything in between.